You can use the pivot table feature of Excel to access some of the most powerful data analysis that Excel can provide. Pivot tables allow you to organize massive amounts of data in more coherent and meaningful ways to extract exactly what you want to know from the data. One of the most helpful features of pivot tables is the ability to be reorganized quickly and easily to change the information they are displaying and calculating. When you create a pivot table, you are comparing information in your worksheet and then calculating intersecting values of your choosing. In addition to pivot tables, you can also create pivot charts, which use the data from pivot tables but display it in a graphic format. The best way to learn how to use a pivot table is to actually create one with which you can experiment and practice. Excel makes it easy to create a pivot table from your data. Starting in Excel 2013, Excel makes creating pivot tables even easier by offering suggestions as to what type of data you may want to view from within a selected data set or table. These are called recommended pivot tables. When you want to create a recommended pivot table, Excel offers suggestions as to what type of data you may want to initially view within the pivot table based on the data selected. You can then choose a recommendation, and Excel will automatically create a pivot table that shows the selected type of data within a new worksheet. You can then edit and change the pivot table just as you would edit or change a manually created pivot table. Using a recommended pivot table just quickens and simplifies the process of creating a pivot table in Excel. To create a recommended pivot table, click the Insert tab within the ribbon. Then click the Recommended Pivot Tables button in the Tables button group. Then select the source of the data for the pivot table in the Choose Data Source dialog box that appears. Your choices are select a table or range, which pulls the data from your Excel workbook, or use an external data source, which allows you to use data from an existing data connection in your workbook or on your computer. Select the option button for the choice that you prefer. If you select the Select a Table or Range option button, you can click the Collapse Expand dialog box button at the right end of the Table Range field to collapse the dialog box down to a single line. You can then click and drag over the cell range or table that you want to use as the data source for your pivot table. Then click the same Collapse Expand dialog box button again to expand the dialog box when you have finished selecting the data cells within your workbook. Alternately, if you want to use a named table as your data source, type the name of the table into the Table Range field instead of manually selecting the cell range reference. You could also type an absolute cell range reference into the Table Range field if desired, instead of manually selecting the cell range. If you select the Use an External Data Source option button, then click the Choose Connection button to open the Existing Connections dialog box. Within the Existing Connections dialog box, you will see any connections available. You can use the Show drop-down at the top of the dialog box to select the All Connections choice if needed. That will then display all data connections within your workbook, computer, and network within 3 separate sections within this dialog box. Select the data connection that you would like to use for your pivot table from the connections shown within this dialog box, and then click the Open button to return to the Choose Data Source dialog box. Note that while you can select data tables from existing data connections to external data sources, such as an Access database, you cannot select Excel tables that you have added to the workbook's data model when creating a recommended pivot table. To use Excel tables that have been saved to the workbook's data model as your data source, you must manually create the pivot table using the Pivot Table button. We will cover doing this in the next lesson. When you're finished selecting a data source, click the OK button to continue. Excel will then display the Recommended Pivot Charts dialog box. The left side of this dialog box will display several different types of data analyses that you can view within a pivot table. Select the type of pivot table that you wish to create from this listing. You can then see a large preview of the selected pivot table in the area to the right. You can then click the OK button at the bottom of this dialog box to create the selected pivot table. Note that if your data selection did not include enough data fields or contain too many blank or repetitive cell entries, you may not be able to create a recommended pivot table. If this is the case, then Excel will inform you of that fact within this dialog box. However, you can still click the OK button to continue and insert a blank pivot table into a new workbook. You will simply need to manually create the data that you want to show within the pivot table by using the Pivot Table Fields task pane. After you've created a pivot table, you will see the Pivot Table Fields task pane appear at the side of your workbook window. In the Pivot Table Fields pane, you will see the information from your data source. Note the fields that have been added to the pivot table and into which quadrant these fields have been placed at the bottom of the pane. These settings determine the values displayed within your pivot table. You can change the values displayed within the pivot table by using the Pivot Table Fields task pane. You can check the checkbox next to a field in the Choose Fields to Add to Report section that you want to add to the pivot table. If you check a field, Excel will add that field into one of the 4 quadrants shown in the Drag Fields Between Areas Below section at the bottom of the task pane. For pivot tables, these quadrants are filters, columns, rows, and values. At that point, you can click and drag the field shown from one quadrant to another based on what function or layout you want the pivot table to show. Note that fields that are placed into the Values section are calculated using the sum function by default.